So, yeah, welcome. My name is Philipp, and I'm going to present to you today the topic SAP Interoperability Wars, episode 4, A New Hope. So, is there hope for SAP Interoperability? Spoiler alert, unfortunately, only little. Yeah, who am I? So, my shell says I'm PL, that's quite little. A little bit more. I'm a full stack developer focusing on Java and JavaScript mostly. ABAP usually for IDocs debugging, so whenever we get something into the system, typically we have to dig into ABAP. That's what I do. Previously, I worked as a research assistant at the Vienna University of Technology, and I co-founded Ecosio. Currently, my focus is SAP EDI integration. That will also be the focus of this talk. And I'm also a co-organizer of the Inside Track in Vienna, together with the guys from Cadaxo and Christian. Spoiler, it's on the 23rd of November 2019. Vienna is really an awesome travel destination, so I can highly recommend you the Inside Track. Yeah, that is my Twitter handle. In regard to the script, let's see what B2B interoperability in general is, then compare EDI to Enterprise Application Integration, EAI, then challenges in SAP interoperability. And then let's also look what SAP itself is doing in order to cope these issues of interoperability, in particular with the Cloud Platform Integration Advisor. So B2B interoperability is mostly concerned with those two blue fields here. As we can see, it's about B2B, so companies exchanging data with other companies, but also companies exchanging data with governments. And in particular, recently, that gained significance in regard to tax reports, but also massively due to electronic invoicing. And we'll also see that here in Germany with the X-Rechnung. Typically, we are not so much concerned with the consumers or the administration itself as different domains. And whenever we do B2B interoperability there, we're mostly talking about electronic data interchange, so sending something to another party. And since this talk is called SAP Interoperability Wars, let's see what B2B interoperability and the Galactic Senate have in common. Well, probably at first sight you would say, yeah, not so much, but actually we have multiple different parties which are involved in the entire game here. Just like in the Senate, we have different languages, not spoken languages, but in particular export and import formats, and as well as B2B exchange standards. Definitely we have different hidden agendas of the different parliamentary groups, and Rand from my side, also network of intrigues, typically mostly money driven when it comes to luring or forcing somebody into some B2B network. Yet decisions have to be made in such an environment, and we need to find a quorum, and we need to find a decision. Well, here's the view of some vendors on the term interoperability, and this looks entirely different to the parliament. This is rather this approach here. So the vendors like the central control, where no interoperability is necessary as there is just one party. And interoperability among the acting parties is not necessary. So, for instance, here we can see the white guys, the consultants, here the black guys are the developers, and so on, somebody in central command. I mean, this is wishful thinking. Interoperability projects rather look like that. So this is war on the right-hand side, other developers, left-hand side, functional consultants. So they go down like the flies. It's our purpose here and our duty to counteract here. But going back from Star Wars to nowadays world, where do the roots of interoperability lie? Do you know what airport that is here? Not it's Tempelhof. Yeah, so a very famous airport, nowadays closed in Berlin, and it's probably most famous for the Berlin airlift. And what has the Berlin airlift to do with interoperability? Well, more than you think. In 1948, the Soviet Union blocked all land-based access to the city of West Berlin. So the Western Allies had to start to bring in food, clothes, and all material of everyday living via planes. So so-called Racing bombers, or Rosinenbomber in German. And there was a huge effort from a logistic perspective in order to supply that city just by means of airplanes. And there are two very important lessons we've learned from that Berlin airlift. And the first is in regard to the products. As you can probably imagine back then, these products weren't uniquely identified. So we had different languages, German, French, English, then different units, such as the imperial units on the one hand side, food, inches and so on, and metric system on the other hand side. So interoperability was hard. Second, there was no handling unit. So nowadays everything is about Euro pallets or containers, air freight and whatever. So that wasn't standardized yet. So that was a huge thing. And the other approach was, as you can see, planes had to land within very short time frames. So unloading, quick unloading was of utmost importance. So what they started to do is, by radio, because there was no electronic communication basically, they started to pre-radio in. So the next plane which is coming has milk loaded. So they could prepare the ground logistics to unload the milk quickly and get the plane back up in the air and get more milk or more medicine, whatever, into the city. So basically the learning is the information about the exchange goods is as important as the goods themselves. And what has that to do with EDI nowadays? One of the officers, Edward Gilbert, was responsible from the United States Air Force for the Berlin airlift, went back to the United States and started to develop trade standards there, which ultimately became ANSI ASC X12, which is a very famous EDI standard in North America. So it's sort of the brother or the sister of our EDIFACT. So actually a little bit of Berlin airlift is in all our nowadays supply chains. Well, the three main requirements of electronic data interchange, to come back to a more technological approach, is we need a unique identification of exchange products, services, as well as partners. Second, a unique representation of the exchanged information and an exchange protocol to bring the information from A to B. And in regard to unique identification, it's typically difficult for machines. If we look at that address here, this is our subsidiary here in Munich, in Leobrechtingstraße. And you as humans, you look at these addresses, you will immediately see that actually that is the same address. And that is because you have cognitive capabilities. You can deduct from the address itself that the same is meant here. But for the machine, typically, 4 different addresses are being identified. So actually, such representations are good for postal services, but are bad for machines. Machines, like other things, more. An example here from SAP, so unique identifiers. So typically in database terms, we would speak about primary keys. And one idea could actually be, yeah, we could take such a key and use such a key, such an SAP internal key for our electronic data interchange. That is a bad idea. So one does not simply use the primary key in EDI because it's no longer primary. It might be unique in your machine, but it definitely is not in the EDI context, so when communicating to other companies. So where do we take these unique numbers from? There are 3 different approaches. One is GS1, so Global Standards 1. They sell global location numbers. Second are Dun and Bradstreet numbers. And third are bilateral agreements. So for instance, BMW in Munich, since they're quite large, they say we are in that EDI context BMW-AG, or Jaguar Land Rover, for instance, goes by the abbreviation JLR. Well, actually, I do envy the guys of Global Standards 1. Here, for instance, is a global location number. As you can see, it consists of a company prefix. This prefix is globally unique, and no other company has the prefix, so it guarantees that that is a unique number, and the location reference can then be used by the company itself. And I do love that kind of business model because actually they are selling numbers. And as you can probably imagine, production of numbers is quite expensive. Not at all. Unfortunately, I didn't have the idea, so I have to go with the EDI stuff here. But still fine. Yeah, tired already? You probably are. So a Red Bull might be good. Red Bull came typically from a shelf at Edeka at Metro, and in order to get the Red Bull into the shelf of Edeka, into the shelf of Metro and Aldi and the like, we use that numbers on the back of the can. We call them the so-called global trade identification numbers, and they are also based on these GLN numbers of GS1. Actually, that number is globally unique, so every can on that planet has the same number. So even whether it's sold in the United States, in Brazil, or wherever, is always the same number. So it's not only on the product itself, we also heavily use it as part of the serial shipping container code that are labels attached to handling units, such as the pallet here. And as you can see here, that NVE, so would be Nummer der Versandeinheit, the German equivalent of serial shipping container code, allows you to uniquely identify the handling unit. And why would that be necessary? Well, think of such a scenario. So there's a typical cross-docking scenario you would find with Edeka, but also with BMW and so on, or the logistics center in Germersheim of Daimler and so on. You couldn't simply run that entire center without uniquely identifying every piece of information, every piece of material which goes in there and goes out there. But going back to the probably more theoretical part, in regard to interoperability, we talk about enterprise application integration and electronic data interchange. Enterprise application integration is always within the company, and electronic data interchange is typical when you communicate with your suppliers, customers, or other partners, such as the government, for instance. If one is to look at an enterprise application scenario, we can see here, for instance, it's a little bit small. There is a client and a server, typically API-driven nowadays. So most of these APIs go with RESTful or JSON XML, some SOAP, WSDL, whereas other patterns exist as well, such as message bus systems, shared database, and whatever patterns are out there. There's one fact, it's typically quite tightly coupled. And we don't need tightly coupled systems. In regard to electronic data interchange, there it's more loose coupled. So typically we send the message to the other party and that is it. And later on the second message is sent and so on. And it's not a democratic situation out there. The larger partner typically dictates. So such as BMW, Edeka and the like, they will typically tell you what to do. So not only the exchange format, but also the protocol. Me personally, way more fun because it's so heterogeneous and no project is like the other. If you are to go, if you are to go back home with from that inside track and you ask what is electronic data interchange, well, it's not a single technology, it's rather a concept, and it's the exchange of structured electronic documents between software systems of different companies with minimal human intervention. So let's get back to the challenges. What do we have in regard to challenges in SAP systems? First, it's all about the information representation. So what do we exchange with an SAP system? Let's take a sales order here in a system, transaction VA03. So typically when somebody orders something at your company, you would enter information there. There are basically two means to do that, either manually, so you simply type in the stuff, or you get it into the system in an automated manner. And that is typically done using IDocs. So here's an example, just to check whether you're still paying attention what's wrong here. It's a delivery IDoc that will not create a sales order. Of course, you knew that at first sight, didn't you? Then, yeah. It's a delivery. Yeah, the basic type is delivery. Yeah, then working with IDocs, typically we go to transaction WE60, we fetch the XML schema definition from there and use it in order to set up document mapping. So for us, XML schema is of utmost importance. Unfortunately, it's not always super smooth, in particular if set IDocs or custom IDocs are being used and the documentation is not being done. Oftentimes, you will also hear the business saying, look, the other partner is using SAP as well. We are using SAP. Why do we need any EDI standard? We will simply take IDocs and send them from A to B. Because IDoc should be an EDI standard. Well, here's my answer to that. Say IDoc is an EDI standard one more time, I dare you. The point is, IDoc is an excellent choice in order to get data into an SAP system or out of an SAP system, but it's definitely not an EDI standard. Data exchange formats out there, here's just a few examples, there is an abundance of different standards out there. So Edifact is by far the most important. Edifact ENCOM is heavily used in the retail industry. We have X-Rechnung now, which is becoming a big thing in Germany next year. Then Tradacoms is quite exotic, it's still used in the United Kingdom, or ANSI in North America, or VDA is Verband der Deutschen Automobilindustrie. Yeah, in order to cope with that abundance, standardization organizations have started to standardize these document standards. The problem is there are so many standardization organizations and they produce so many standards that again we have heterogeneity. So for instance, you and CFACT on the upper left-hand side, they are standardizing the artifact standard, and there is no single artifact standard. Each year, at least 2 versions of the artifact standards are being published. So after 10 years, you end up with 20 different standards, which are essentially not necessarily compatible. And same applies for RosettaNet in the semiconductor and so on. So how can we cope with that challenge? Well, actually, it's just like with the Security Council in New York City. Also there, different nations are sitting at a huge table, and yet they can communicate with each other. And that is mainly due to these unseen heroes at the back, and they translate in real time from English to Russian, from Russian to English, and so on, allowing them to communicate in real time. And the exact same principle applies here. So we have the conversion or the mapping, which is the translation between different formats. So an SAP system on the left-hand side can then be is then able to communicate, for instance, with a Microsoft Dynamics 365 system on the right-hand side. That is typically if 2 systems are being involved. But then let's do it a little bit more easy and say, what about business to government communication? Here's an interoperability use case from Italy. I don't know, probably you've been in touch with that thing, but since the 1st of January 2019, so in January this year, Italy has no more paper invoices. So each invoice in Italy goes through a central system, and basically there is no more paper invoice. I mean, of course there are, but they are just for cosmetic reasons, they serve no tax relevance. So each invoice must be communicated to the central SDI system, which stands for Sistema di Interscambio. And actually, we had a lot of projects in regard to the SDI where we're taking IDocs, we're converting it to the invoice PA format, and we send it through SOAP WSDL web services. And now one could think, okay, there are SAP systems on the left-hand side, there are IDocs, so how many mappings do you think we could reuse on a one-to-one basis, so without any alteration? Since we have an export format on the left-hand side, it's always SAP, it's always IDoc, and there is a fixed format on the right-hand side, it's always invoice PA. How large do you think was the reusability rate?
0.
Yes, it was exactly 0. So basically no mapping could be reused, and that is simply due to the fact that no system is like the other. So the SD customizations are different, the roles which are being used are different, the condition techniques are so different with all the systems, it's necessary to set up a new mapping all the time. And there is another challenge, that is the invoice PA standard you can see here. So it's a screenshot from Altoba MapForce. What's wrong with that picture here? I mean, it's syntactically correct, it's an XML schema. It's in Italian. So all the element names are in Italian, all the attribute names are in Italian, and all the documentation is in Italian. So second interoperability challenge, no English, but Italian. So either you speak Italian or you don't get it. Yeah, there was another more process-oriented challenge. Then yeah, rekeying of information. Here is a challenge in the automotive industry. Daimler, for instance, heavily relies on unique identifications of their factories. We call it so-called Odette IDs. So here is one, for instance, for Germersheim, which is factory 006. And the challenge is you need to get that receiver identification on a per factory basis from the exported IDoc. And now the problem is, within the SAP system, you typically have the internal ship-to number, might be 4711 or whatever. Then there's the service provider, and then the right-hand side, Daimler demands the Odette ID of Germersheim. So definitely the recommendation is to rekey in the SAP system, but oftentimes the business request is, we don't want to maintain that in SAP, please rekey in the mapping, we have our internal IDs. Again, one doesn't simply rekey in the EDI mapping, as this leads to absolutely unmaintainable situations, where some logic is dislocated from SAP. Third, oftentimes we are missing information. So as said before, we are heavily relying on global location numbers for sender and receiver IDs. Here is an example from Edifact EANCOM. We have all that information in the IDoc. So for the experts among you, it's in the control record EDI DC40. But unfortunately, that information is located in the logical address of the sender, and the logical address of the receiver is oftentimes missing. In fact, if you are running a vanilla SAP system, nothing is filled there. So either you have a PI or a PO or a business connector, whatever in place, which does that for you, or you need some user exits. But the vanilla system wouldn't fill out these fields. Fourth, processing compliance. Let's take a scenario here from the retail industry. So a supplier on the left-hand side and the buyer on the right-hand side. There is a side where the dark force resides here, and this is the right-hand side. But Edeka and Metro is not your father in that case, but they are simply mandating the process you should comply with. The thing is, all these companies, they run SAP systems or not, in case of Liegl, for instance, no, not yet, and or soon, they force you into fulfilling that process requirements. The thing here is, even if your system is capable to fulfill receipt advices or the responses or the changes and the like, not necessarily all the suppliers will do. Fifth challenge are the exchange protocol. It's a sort of nightmare out there, I have to admit. So you're in the lucky position in your SAP system with your creditors, with your debtors, but on the right-hand side, there is a multitude of different standards you have to fulfill in regard to the documents, in regard to the exchange protocols, X400, OFTP2, AS2, then value-added networks, SMTP, SFTP, FTPS, you name them, RESTful services, JSON, XML, so every day something new, so to say. So basically, the EDI converter or the service provider helps you then in order to cope with these requirements. Number 6, an all-time favorite is business and IT mismatch. So even if interoperability is there and set up, it doesn't necessarily mean that it is working. So let's take a look at how the business sees it, within the rubber duck and the rainbow in the background, and it's all easy cheesy and so on. And all of a sudden you get that I'm missing a purchase order. So the document of my customer didn't arrive. So you, or me in that case, as integration expert, you approach and then you look under the hood. So you basically, you go to the backend part of the system, which looks like that, in that case. And I'm not saying it's the ABAP code, not at all. It's just rather how it's done. And then you look, for instance, on how is it going with the IDocs. And I know it's a little bit small here. You can see that 50% of the inbound IDocs fail here. So how could some purchase order ever end up in the front end if it already fails down there? And side note, that is not from a test system. I took it from the production system of a customer. So you see how real world integration then oftentimes goes. I'm not saying, of course, from which customer. Yeah, a look ahead, SAP Cloud Platform. There is a nice system coming up. It's called the Integration Advisor. In order to better understand what it does, let's look at our day-to-day job. How do we do B2B integration? We have a sender document format, we have a receiver document format. We call it message implementation guidelines, and we use these specifications in order to create runtime artifacts. And that is first done on a design time level. So you connect the dots, name here goes to name there, postal code here goes to postal code there, and so on. And then you create runnable artifacts and you ship them to an engine. And that engine is then capable of sending and receiving these documents according to the specifications you did before. So the fully automated B2B part is below, but everything at the top is full manual labor. So this is real consultant work, real manual labor you have to do there. And whenever something changes, of course, you're doing the tests again and you iterate. The Integration Content Advisor, as part of the SAP Cloud Platform Integration, has an interesting approach here. So it provides a library of type systems, so message implementation, guidelines of EDIFACT standards, of ANSI standards, and so on. These interface specifications, which you can use in order to put one interface specification here and one on the other side, and it will automatically deduct mapping specifications from it through certain algorithms. SAP, of course, doesn't disclose, but the goal is that the entire mapping thing is a fully automated task. So at least that's the future goal here. As you can see, this is from a YouTube video. Do you see how many views that YouTube video has since February? 109. So not so much. So if we are to assess what is the Integration Content Advisor becoming in the future, well, it could become this here, so a highly effective means in order to cope with interoperability challenges, or it can massively fail, as in the Star Wars saga. So I don't know yet. Yeah, to wrap up, if you're still thirsty, here are some book recommendations. I can highly recommend. It's IDocs and APIs für SAP, a quite concise book. Then a very extensive one, 900 pages, Architecting EDI with SAP IDocs from Hasi Petros. Or I can also recommend our blog, so I heavily blog on interoperability topics. Here, for instance, I have IDoc Stahldienst, where I'm working on IDoc interoperability tasks. Okay, then thank you, and may the force always be with you and your interoperability projects, and I'm happy to answer any questions in case there are. Thank you. Actually, Tobias, did you put the bottles here? Was it you with the bottles? Yeah. You know that I had a massive argument with my significant other back in Austria when I said I'm going to Munich and it's only work and about EDI and SAP and so on, and now I'm standing here in front of beer bottles. So that totally ruins my story. Yeah. It was a pleasure. Yeah.
Does anyone got any questions? Do you need the microphone for your question? What May 4th?
May the force be with you. It's a geek joke. May the force be with you. So the 4th of May is Star Wars Day. If you watch Big Bang Theory, for instance, a lot, I do a lot. That's a common joke within the geek scene.